Miami, July 1984. 3:42 a.m. The Florida Everglades. Silence. In the thick, humid air of the swamp, the only sound is the rhythmic chirp of crickets and the distant low hum of an engine. Inside a weathered safe house, tucked away from the neon lights of South Beach, a man sits by a dark window. He isn't holding a weapon, he isn't clutching a stack of cash. Instead, he's holding a small black notebook. It's filled with numbers, dates, and names that could set the entire city of Miami on fire. Suddenly, the hum grows louder. It's the distinct, aggressive roar of a custom motorcycle, the signature calling card of Griselda Blanco's most lethal executioners. The man has exactly 4 minutes to decide his fate. Will he die a loyalist to the woman they call the godmother, or will he become a ghost? The door handle turns. A shadow falls across the floor. But instead of a bullet, a federal agent whispers a code word through the wood. This was the moment everything changed. This was the moment a $3 million bounty became active, and the man who knew too much realized he had nothing left to lose. This is the story of the night. The godmother met the only man she couldn't break with a bullet, a man whose mind held the keys to her kingdom and whose life was valued at a staggering price. It is a journey into a high-stakes chess match where loyalty has a price tag, and the truth is the most expensive commodity in Miami. To understand how we got to this safe house in the swamp, you have to understand Miami in the early 80s. It was a city drowning in blood and billions of dollars. This was the peak of the cocaine cowboy era, a time when the sun-drenched streets of South Florida were being rewritten by the whim of one woman, Griselda Blanco. She had consolidated power through sheer, unadulterated brutality, earning her reputation as the Black Widow. But by 1984, there was a problem. Her empire was growing faster than she could count. The money wasn't just coming in, it was flooding the city, moving at a speed that defied logic. The DEA was finally starting to map the veins of her organization, looking for the one weak point in a heart made of stone. In this world, power wasn't just about who you killed, it was about who managed the flow. Griselda was no longer just fighting rival cartels, she was fighting a system of her own making that was growing too large to control. Paranoia began to seep into the foundation of her palace. The rules of the street were being rewritten. Enter Max Vance. They called him the architect. Max didn't touch the product, he didn't pull triggers, and he didn't hang out in the blood-soaked clubs of Brickell. He was a high-level logistics expert, a man of cold, hard logic. He knew every shipping route from the jungles of Colombia to the private docks of the Florida Keys. He knew every offshore bank account in the Caymans and every shell company in Panama. He was the ghost in the machine, the man who made the billions of dollars of illicit profit look like legitimate real estate investments. For years, he was Griselda's most protected asset. He was the only person who saw the entire board. While the hitmen saw the targets and the dealers saw the street corners, Max saw the architecture of the entire empire. He was the man who knew where every dollar was buried. Griselda trusted him, or at least as much as a woman like her could trust anyone. Years earlier, when Max first proved his worth by laundering $10 million in a single weekend without leaving a single digital footprint, she had given him a small, tarnished silver St. Jude medallion. It was a token of her protection. In her world, the patron saint of lost causes was a symbol of belonging to the inner circle. Max kept it in his pocket, a constant weight that reminded him of who he served. But as the bodies began to pile up in the streets of Miami, that weight started to feel like a lead anchor. He watched as Griselda's suspicion turned into a sickness. She began to see betrayal in every shadow, even among those who had been with her since the beginning. The atmosphere in Miami was reaching a boiling point. The federal government was pouring resources into the city, and Special Agent Miller, a relentless investigator with a reputation for patience, was closing in. Miller didn't want the street dealers. He didn't even want the shooters. He wanted the brain. He realized that Max Vance was the only person alive who could connect the blood on the pavement to the bank accounts in Switzerland. But Max was invisible, protected by a wall of silence and Griselda's terrifying reputation. That was until the godmother made the one mistake she couldn't take back. It happened on a Tuesday. Griselda called Max to a private suite at the Mutiny Hotel, the epicenter of the cocaine trade. The air was thick with expensive cigars and the smell of gunpowder. Griselda wasn't interested in the logistics of the next shipment. She was interested in loyalty. She began to talk about Max's family, specifically his young daughter, Elena. She spoke about how beautiful the girl was, how she had her father's eyes, and how tragic it would be if anything ever happened to interrupt her bright future. It wasn't a direct threat, but in Griselda's world there are no idle observations. She was reminding Max that she didn't just own his mind, she owned everything he loved. She treated a man of logic like a man of the streets, thinking that fear would tighten his leash. But Max Vance wasn't a street soldier. He was a strategist. He understood that once a threat is made against your family, the contract of loyalty is already broken. He realized that the silver medallion in his pocket wasn't a symbol of protection anymore. It was a target. Griselda had violated the unspoken code. She had turned her most valuable asset into her most dangerous liability. What she didn't know was that Max hadn't just been keeping her books for his own health. He had been keeping a black box of evidence, a detailed record of every transaction, every bribe, and every murder order she had ever issued. It was his life insurance, and she had just given him the reason to use it. Within 24 hours of that meeting, the architect vanished. He didn't take a suitcase. He didn't go to his office. He simply walked out of his fortified home and disappeared into the humidity of the Florida night. When Griselda's accountants tried to access the offshore accounts the next morning, they found themselves staring at a screen of encrypted code they couldn't bypass. The money, hundreds of millions of dollars, was frozen. The system was locked. The heart of the empire had stopped beating, and the only man who could restart it was gone. The reaction was instantaneous. Griselda didn't just want Max found, she wanted him erased. She broadcast a $3 million contract through the underworld, a bounty so large it turned every associate, every informant, and every low-level criminal in South Florida into a potential assassin. The word went out from the Everglades to the Keys. Find the architect, and you never have to work a day in your life. But Max had a head start. He knew how the hunters thought because he was the one who had mapped their routes for years. He knew which safe houses were compromised and which ones were truly off the grid. He reached out to the only person who could offer him a way out, Special Agent Miller. The deal was simple. Max would provide the keys to the kingdom, the names, the dates, and the silver medallion that proved his proximity to the godmother. In exchange, he wanted a future for himself and his family, a future that Griselda Blanco couldn't touch. But the path to that future was paved with landmines. The cartel's reach was everywhere. 3 days after his disappearance, a massive shootout erupted at a suburban mall where Max was supposed to meet a contact. He narrowly escaped, the bullets shattering the glass of a storefront just inches from his head. It was a message. There was nowhere to hide. Max knew he had to escalate the situation. He couldn't just hide. He had to prove his value before the cartel caught up to him. He initiated a high-risk dead man's switch, leaking a single redacted page of the ledger to a contact in the press. It was a warning shot. It proved to the government that he had the goods, and it proved to Griselda that he was prepared to burn the whole world down to save his daughter. The stakes were no longer just about money or drugs. They were about the survival of an era. The godmother was losing her grip, and the man who kept her books was now the one writing the final chapter. As the clock ticked toward the date of the grand jury, the city held its breath. The man with the notebook was still out there, and the $3 million bounty was still active, waiting for someone to collect. 6 hours before the grand jury was set to convene, the silence in the Everglades safe house was shattered, not by a gunshot, but by the cold realization of a double cross. Inside that humid, cramped room, Max Vance looked at the federal marshal assigned to protect him and saw something in the man's eyes that didn't belong to the law. It was greed. A $3 million bounty does strange things to the soul. It turns protectors into predators and allies into ghosts. The marshal's hand drifted toward his holster, his movement stiff, telegraphing a betrayal that had been paid for in a suitcase of cash delivered to a motel in Hialeah just 2 hours prior. Max didn't panic. He had spent years calculating risks for Griselda Blanco, and he knew that every system, even a federal one, had a price point. He simply leaned back, his hand inside his jacket, and whispered a single name: Rivi. From the shadows of the hallway, Jorge Rivi Ayala stepped into the light. Griselda's top enforcer, the man who had been sent to collect the $3 million by delivering Max's head, was standing there, but he wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a cigarette. Rivi looked at the compromised marshal, then at Max, and let out a slow, tired puff of smoke. In the twisted logic of the Miami underworld, Rivi had realized something Griselda hadn't. If Max fell, the entire structure fell, including Rivi's own future. The enforcer didn't kill the marshal. He simply disarmed him with a chilling efficiency that suggested he'd done it 1,000 times before. He looked at Max and nodded. "The godmother is waiting for you at the courthouse," Rivi said, his voice like gravel. "She thinks you're coming there to die. Don't disappoint her." This was the final shift in the atmosphere. The hitman had become the escort. The drive to the federal courthouse in downtown Miami was a journey through a city that felt like a ticking time bomb. The streets were lined with the expensive cars of the cartel's eyes and ears. Every intersection felt like a potential ambush. But Max Vance sat in the back of the armored transport, with a calm that unnerved the agents around him. He wasn't looking at the streets. He was looking at the small tarnished silver St. Jude medallion in his palm, the patron saint of lost causes. For years, this piece of metal had been his badge of office, a gift from Griselda that symbolized his place at the right hand of power. Now it was a heavy reminder of the cost of that power. He knew that in a few minutes he would be stepping into a room filled with people who wanted him dead, facing a woman who considered herself a queen. When the doors to the courtroom swung open, the air seemed to leave the room. The gallery was a wall of stone-faced men in tailored Italian suits, Griselda's lieutenants, her accountants, and her soldiers. They were there to intimidate, to remind the witness that the cartel's reach didn't stop at the mahogany railing of the witness stand. And there, in the center of it all, sat Griselda Blanco. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like a grandmother in a silk blouse. But her eyes were two black coals, fixed on Max with a predatory intensity that would have withered a lesser man. The judge called for order, but the silence was already absolute. Everyone in that room expected Max to fold. They expected him to take the fifth, to claim a lapse in memory, or to look at the floor in shame. They expected the architect to crumble under the weight of the godmother's gaze. Instead, Max Vance walked to the stand, with his head held high. He didn't look at the judge and he didn't look at the prosecutor. He looked directly at Griselda. The tension was a physical force, a wire stretched so tight it was vibrating. As he took his seat, the prosecutor asked the first question. "Mr. Vance, can you identify the individual responsible for the financial orchestration of the Blanco organization?" The room held its breath. Max didn't speak immediately. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver St. Jude medallion, and placed it slowly, deliberately on the wooden ledge of the witness stand. The clink of the metal against the wood sounded like a gavel. "That woman," Max said, pointing a steady finger toward Griselda. "She didn't just run the organization. She was the organization." The power shift was instantaneous and total. In that moment, the godmother wasn't the one in control. The man with the receipts was. Max didn't just testify, he dismantled her piece by piece. For the next 4 hours, he laid out the architecture of her empire with the precision of a surgeon. He cited bank account numbers from memory. He detailed the exact dates of shipments disguised as legitimate imports. He named the politicians who had been bought and the police officers who had been paid to look the other way. Every word was a hammer blow to the foundation of the Blanco kingdom. Griselda's expression didn't change, but her knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of the defense table. She had tried to break him with a bullet, then with a threat to his family, and finally with a $3 million bounty. But she had forgotten that Max Vance lived in a world of numbers, and in his world the math finally favored the truth. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the Miami skyline, the damage was done. The black box of evidence Max had kept as life insurance was now part of the public record. The gallery of stone-faced men began to shift uncomfortably. They realized that Max wasn't just taking down Griselda, he was taking down all of them. The immunity he had secured for himself and his family was the only thing that kept him safe from the immediate fallout, but the dominoes had already begun to fall. In the next 72 hours, federal warrants were issued for 32 high-ranking associates across 3 continents. The financial infrastructure of the Blanco organization, a machine that had moved billions of dollars, was dismantled in a matter of days. Bank accounts were frozen, shell companies were shuttered, and the flow of capital that fueled the cocaine cowboy era was cut off at the source. Griselda Blanco, the woman who had once held an entire city in a grip of fear, was forced into a defensive posture that she would never truly recover from. The architect had done what no rival cartel and no police raid could do. He had erased her legacy by exposing the paper trail that proved her guilt. 6 months later, the dust had settled, but the landscape of Miami was forever changed. The neon light still buzzed, and the ocean still hit the shore, but the era of the untouchable godmother was over. Max Vance and his family vanished into the witness protection program, becoming ghosts in a system they helped build. Elena, the daughter who had been the catalyst for his betrayal, was safe, growing up in a place where the name Blanco meant nothing. Max left behind the silver medallion, the black notebook, and the $3 million bounty. He traded a kingdom of blood for a quiet life of anonymity, a trade that most men in his position would never have the courage to make. The city of Miami learned a new rule during those frantic months. You can survive a bullet, but you can't survive the truth once it's been recorded. Griselda's fall wasn't just a victory for the DEA, it was a lesson in the fragility of power built on fear. When you treat the people who hold your secrets like tools, you shouldn't be surprised when they turn into weapons. In the empire of crime, the man who pulls the trigger is a tool, but the man who keeps the books is the master. Max Vance proved that the pen is mightier than the lead, especially when that pen is backed by the survival of a father's love. Griselda Blanco's story would eventually end in a violent street corner in Medellin years later, a victim of the very cycle she helped create. But the true end of her reign happened in that Miami courtroom, the moment the architect placed a silver medallion on a wooden stand and chose his family over his code. It was the night the godmother realized that some men can't be bought, and some betrayals are worth more than $3 million. Now I have to ask you, if the person you trusted most threatened the people you love, would you honor the code of silence and go to the grave with your secrets, or would you burn the world down to save them? Would you be the loyalist, or would you be the architect? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see how other empires fell from the inside out, there's another story waiting for you right here on the channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep the history coming. Until next time.